In this section, we're going to kick off the TinyML pipeline for visual wake words by starting off with data collection. As I've always said, data is king. So we're going to start talking about data collection and pre-processing before we go through the rest of the parts of the pipeline. As with any data, always remember to identify the key requirements of the license file that you need to have that corresponds to how you intend for the model to be actually used in the field. Because if you don't read the licenses properly for your data sources, you can get into a lot of trouble. Let me give you an example. There was a person who went out and scraped Tinder for about 40,000 images to create a facial data set for a Kaggle ML competition. That sounds like an awesome thing. You're using some existing data that's out there, and then you're building a custom data set. Well, this is what Tinder had to say officially. This person has violated our terms of service, and we're going to take appropriate action and investigate further. Well, that's not a good thing, because this means that if anyone happened to build anything that's interesting with the TinyML model into an application that used this data set, well, they can no longer be making any business because the data set was polluted, which means that you don't have the right to use the model. So you need to make sure your data is clean. But you can actually reuse existing publicly available data in order to create a subset of the data. So let's assume, for instance, I have ImageNet, right, which has got over 20,000 different classes in it, over 14 million images. But in TinyML, given that you are typically caring about one particular domain, as in the case of our doorbell example, it was a cat. So what we really need is just cat pictures. And in this particular case, I don't need a whole bunch of labeled data that is irrelevant for my application use case. I might be able to reuse the existing data of only images of cats and balance out, with all the other images that are not cats. So there is potential to reuse the data. And now this is not a new idea, but this is exactly how, in fact, the Google Brain team behind TinyML actually helped build the visual wake words data set. And the visual wake words data set has one single goal, which is effectively looking at trying to identify a person in a picture. And that is the whole visual wake words data set, what it's all about. But the critical thing we are really doing over here is using publicly available data sets in order to create new data sources. All right, let's take a concrete example. Here's an image that comes from the Microsoft Cocoa data set for common objects in our everyday context. What this data set has is a whole bunch of different kinds of annotations of many different people, objects, and so forth. And specifically by looking at this image, what the data set tells you is that, well, there's a person over here, which has got an annotation around him with a bounding box. Well, if you know this exact location in a bigger image, you can just crop out this image of the person and create yourself a new, very specific image of just one person. But hey, there happens to be another person in there. So you can crop out the other person and then label that person as well. And so this way, we are effectively dynamically creating a new data set out of the original data set. And this is a remarkably powerful thing. It's a very simple concept, but as long as the licenses are okay, you're good to go. Because you are effectively paying the cost upfront for building a very large data set, but then you're able to dynamically create specific instances of data sets that you want down the line. For example, here we can create a person detection data set, and you might be able to create a cat detection data set and so forth. Well, there are some challenges that you've got to watch out for. The original data set was collected with something in mind. There was a specific goal in mind when that data set was collected. Is that data set really going to meet the needs of your particular TinyML application? It may, but it also may not. For example, if the data set that you need is something about planets, being able to detect planets and their terrains and so forth. Well, if you image this data set that you have over here with cars, trucks, and so forth, all about objects that are only on this particular planet, is not necessarily going to help you with looking at other planets, because the data simply doesn't exist in the data set. So you have to worry about that, whether the data is actually there. The second thing is whether there is a bias because you have to look at the distribution of the samples and make sure that the data that you are interested in is actually going to be balanced. We talked about this in the data engineering portion section, and we will talk about that even further in the coming days. So make sure you've got all the relevant images and make sure that you've got the right quantity and the quality of the images. And so we are going to effectively be using the visual wake words data set, which shortcuts the whole process of building a person detection data set. And that is why I'm introducing that particular data set in this course. With that said, let's go to the second stage of building the TinyML application.